the cops were following you.
Yeah.
Let's say they were following you and they did everything that you're saying they did. Nonetheless, you killed 7 men.
Yes,
and
you
I'm
did.
asking you, what got you to kill the 7 men?
And I'm telling you because the cops let me keep killing them, Nick. Don't you get it?
Not everybody is killing 7 people. So there must have been something in you.
Case 1, Wanda Jean Allen. For years, police in Oklahoma City were familiar with Wanda Jean Allen. Her name appeared repeatedly in domestic disturbance reports, bar fights, and volatile arguments that never seemed to fully cool down. Friends describe her relationships as intense, emotional, and unpredictable, fueled by jealousy, alcohol, and explosive temper. But no one imagined how violently one argument would finally end. On the night of June 7, 1988, inside a small apartment on the south side of the city, Allen and her longtime partner, Gloria Leathers, began arguing once again. Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices, slammed doors, and the unmistakable sound of a struggle unfolding behind closed walls. What happened next shattered the quiet of the building. A single gunshot echoed through the apartment. Gloria Leathers collapsed to the floor with a fatal wound to the chest. By the time emergency responders arrived, she was already gone. Allen was still inside the apartment, shaken, emotional, and insisting the shooting had been an accident. She told police the gun had discharged during a struggle, that she never intended to pull the trigger, that the chaos happened too fast to control. But investigators weren't convinced. The physical evidence told a different story. The trajectory of the bullet, the position of the weapon, and a lack of signs supporting a violent struggle raised serious doubts about Allen's account. Witness statements painted a picture of escalating violence in the relationship. Threats, past assaults, and repeated confrontations that suggested the argument had been building towards something dangerous. As detectives reconstructed the final moments, prosecutors began to argue that this wasn't a tragic accident. It was an intentional act driven by rage. At trial, jurors listened as forensic experts dismantled Allen's version of events. They heard about her history of violent behavior and previous arrests. They reviewed the physical evidence that contradicted her claims of an accidental discharge. The verdict was swift. Wanda Jean Allen was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. She became the first woman in Oklahoma history to be sentenced to death and ultimately executed. Appeals stretched on for years, but every effort to overturn the conviction failed. On January 11, 2001, Wanda Jean Allen was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. She was 41 years old. A single argument had ended 2 lives. One in an instant, the other slowly behind prison walls. Case 2, Minnie Dean. In the late 1800s, travelers passing through the quiet farming towns of Southland noticed something strange about a small woman who often walked the roads with children in tow. Minnie Dean presented herself as a helpful caretaker, a woman willing to take in unwanted infants when desperate families had nowhere else to turn. To neighbors, she looked harmless, polite, soft-spoken, almost invisible. But behind the lace curtains of her modest home, something far more sinister was unfolding. Babies placed in her care had a habit of vanishing. Records showed children arriving, but never leaving. Parents who asked questions were told vague stories of relatives taking the infants away, or sudden illnesses that required quiet arrangements. In an era with little oversight and poor documentation, the disappearances blended into the background of daily life, until one afternoon shattered the illusion. In 1895, Minnie Dean was seen boarding a train carrying a hat box that appeared far heavier than it should have been. A suspicious railway worker reported it to authorities. When police inspected the container, they made a horrifying discovery: the body of a baby girl inside. The quiet caretaker was suddenly the center of a murder investigation. Officers searched Dean's property in Winton and uncovered shallow graves hidden in the garden, tiny remains wrapped and buried beneath freshly disturbed soil. The scale of the discovery suggested the deaths were not isolated. They were part of a pattern that had gone unnoticed for years. During questioning, Dean offered shifting explanations. Some children had been sick. Some had been adopted out. Some stories contradicted the physical evidence buried in her own yard. The courtroom became packed with stunned spectators. Newspapers called her the baby farmer, a term used for caretakers who accepted payment to raise infants. often with deadly consequences. Prosecutors laid out the physical evidence and eyewitness testimony that tied her directly to the deaths. The jury did not hesitate. Minnie Dean was convicted of murder. The sentence was death. On August 12, 1895, she was hanged at Invercargill Prison, becoming the only woman ever executed in New Zealand's history. The quiet country road she once walked with children fell silent again, but the questions surrounding how many lives truly passed through her care remain unanswered to this day. Case 3. Florence Lasandro. A single gunshot cracked through the quiet streets of Reno just after midnight in 1920. Inside a parked car, a man slumped forward over the steering wheel, blood spreading across his shirt. The engine was still warm. The street was empty. Whoever pulled the trigger had vanished into the darkness within seconds. The victim was identified as Fred Dake, a married man rumored to be involved with a young woman barely out of her teens. That young woman was Florence Lasandro. Florence was only 16 years old, drawn into a secret relationship with Dake that quickly turned complicated. When she became pregnant, panic set in. Dake allegedly promised to help, then began pulling away, afraid of exposure and scandal. What followed was a desperate decision that would change everything. On the night of the killing, Florence met Dake under the cover of darkness. Witnesses later reported seeing a young woman leaving the area moments after the gunshot echoed. Police canvassed the neighborhood, following fragments of testimony that slowly pointed toward Florence and a teenage accomplice, Joseph Douglas. When officers questioned her, cracks appeared quickly, inconsistent statements, nervous slips. Eventually, she admitted her role in the shooting, claiming fear and desperation had driven her actions. The trial captured national attention. A teenage girl facing a murder charge shocked the public. Some saw her as a victim of manipulation and abandonment. Others saw a calculated killer who planned the ambush. Jurors listened as prosecutors outlined the planning, the weapon acquisition, and the coordinated timing of the attack. The verdict landed hard. Guilty of first-degree murder. Florence Lasandro was sentenced to death by hanging, becoming the first woman condemned to execution in Nevada. Appeals and public pleas for mercy followed, but the sentence stood. On November 16, 1920, just weeks after her 17th birthday, Florence Lasandro was executed at the Nevada State Prison. Her youth only deepened the tragedy. A life ended not once, but twice that night in Reno. Case 4, Ruth Ellis. The morning air outside a small cafe in Hampstead carried the usual rhythm of early traffic and clinking dishes. Commuters passed without noticing the tension building just inside the doorway. Ruth Ellis was waiting. When David Blakely stepped onto the pavement moments later, she raised a revolver and fired. Once, twice, again. Blakely collapsed on the sidewalk as bystanders screamed and scattered. Ellis didn't run. She stood motionless, the weapon still in her hand, and quietly told witnesses, "I am guilty. I just shot him." The crime stunned London. Ellis was a glamorous nightclub hostess, known for her beauty and volatile relationships. Blakely was her lover, a man whose jealousy, abuse, and emotional manipulation had dominated their affair. Friends later described bruises, hospital visits, and desperate arguments that spiraled out of control. Their relationship had been collapsing for months. On the day of the shooting, Ellis had waited outside the Mardala pub where Blakely was meeting friends. When he appeared, the confrontation ended in seconds and in blood. Police arrested her at the scene. There was no mystery about who fired the shots. The only question left was why. Inside the courtroom, Ellis admitted she had intended to kill him. The defense attempted to introduce evidence of long-term abuse, emotional instability, and trauma. But British law at the time offered little room for nuance in murder cases. The jury deliberated briefly. Ruth Ellis was found guilty of murder. The sentence was mandatory, death by hanging. Public debate erupted across the country. Newspapers filled with letters demanding mercy. Supporters argued that Ellis had been driven to the edge by violence and despair. Others insisted the law must remain firm, regardless of circumstance. Appeals were denied. On July 13, 1955, Ruth Ellis was executed at Holloway Prison, becoming the last woman ever put to death in the United Kingdom. Her case would later spark national conversations that ultimately helped abolish capital punishment. But for Ellis, that change came too late. Case 5. Aileen Wuornos. Drivers moving along Florida's back highways began noticing things that didn't sit right. A car abandoned near a wooded exit. A body discovered beside a stretch of quiet road. Another man found miles away, shot and left where no one would see him until daylight. At first, the scenes felt disconnected, isolated tragedies scattered across endless pavement. But detectives started connecting the dots. Each victim had been shot at close range. Wallets were missing. Vehicles disappeared. The killings followed the rhythm of the highways, stretching across multiple counties like a trail no one could quite catch. The break came from something small and almost forgettable. A pawn shop receipt tied to stolen property carried fingerprints. When the prints were run through police databases, they matched a woman already known to authorities. Aileen Wuornos, a transit with a long history of arrests and unstable living conditions. Officers located her at a biker bar in Port Orange. She didn't try to flee. She didn't protest. She simply stood, allowed the handcuffs to close around her wrists, and walked out under flashing lights without a word. Inside the interrogation room, Wuornos painted herself as a survivor. She said the man had attacked her, that she had no choice but to shoot, that every killing was self-defense. Her voice shifted between anger, fear, and exhaustion, but the evidence refused to support the story. The victims were shot multiple times. Their belongings were sold for cash. The pattern stretched across county lines with careful consistency. This wasn't chaos. It was repetition. Then the admissions began. 1 killing, then another, then 5 more. 7 men in total. The courtroom dissected her life piece by piece. Prosecutors mapped out the trail of murders. The defense spoke of abuse, trauma, and years of instability that shaped her behavior. Jurors listened to tape confessions, forensic analysis, and witness testimony that painted a picture too heavy to ignore. The verdict came down hard. Guilty. The sentence followed without hesitation. Death, delivered across multiple convictions. Years passed on death row. Appeals failed. Wuornos grew increasingly paranoid and withdrawn. Eventually, she stopped fighting the sentence altogether, telling the court she was ready for it to end. On October 9, 2002, the state of Florida carried out the execution. Aileen Wuornos became one of the few women in American history executed for serial murder. Thank you for watching. If these stories matter to you, subscribe to Crime Whispers. New cases every week, told with facts, tension, and respect for the truth. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next case.